Mowgli belongs to my pack, Shere Khan.
When was it we came to adopt man into the jungle?
He's just a cub.
Does my face not remind you of what a grown man can do?
Hi folks, I'm Ignatiy Vishnevetsky.
And I'm Alex Dowd.
We're here this week at Farmhouse Tavern, just around the corner from the AV Club office.
Welcome to Film Club. So you talk about movies as the sort of sum of their different parts, but sometimes there are movies where the parts are sort of greater than the whole. And that's how I felt watching the new Disney Jungle Book. This is a movie that has a bunch of really strong components, but something about it doesn't click.
I think there's something fundamentally empty in the way it's conceived. It's less an adaptation of the Kipling stories, more an adaptation of the Disney animated film. And most of what it's doing is taking away a certain cartooniness. Now that produces a very interesting effect, because even though this is basically an animated film, but the way it animates all of these animal characters is actually very interesting because it keeps sort of their animal characteristics. They're not that anthropomorphic.
Now they look about as real as an animal that talks can look.
And the performances of the voice actors are very reflective of that. You know, you've got Giancarlo Esposito as a wolf, not doing very much with his voice because his character can't do very much with his face. Whereas, say, Bill Murray playing a bear has a certain larger expressive range.
Yeah, they're very good for the most part.
This is one of those cases where celebrity voice acting actually works. That having been said, the kid is terrible.
And that's the problem for a movie that is 100% a single actor interacting with CGI creations. This gets into the idea of how do you act against a special effect.
Well, the answer apparently is going like this all the time.
Yeah, just gesticulating wildly. For good or bad, a lot of acting in Hollywood movies now is your ability to act against a special effect. And I'm not convinced this kid would be great were this filmed in a traditional sense either.
So there are things that are very interesting here in terms of visual design.
I mean, Favreau...
I was surprised.
Yeah, I'll confess to being a little impressed with how he handles it. I mean, the virtue of his Iron Man film do not come down to how he handles the CGI.
Oh yeah, it all comes down to performance in all of his films. And it's actually kind of surprising that he became a big effects-driven director, because the films that are supposed to be driven by effects, like Zathura or Cowboys and Aliens, they're not good.
No.
But here, the effects carry it. And it does sort of keep up the immersion, because once you've accepted the CGI animals, there's never going to be a point where they're going to show you a real bear, and then you have to believe that the CGI bear in the next shot is the same bear.
So what was your favorite of the vocal performances in the film?
I mean, I like Christopher Walken. I like Bill Murray.
Christopher Walken plays King Louis. He basically plays him as like a mafia don for the monkeys in this temple. One of the better scenes in the movie, I would say.
Well, it's one of the more strikingly staged scenes, because I think if I have a problem visually with this film in terms of style, it's that Favreau is sort of an actor's director in a way. He doesn't have much of a sense of space or landscape.
Yeah, there's almost like reverse shot with CGI animals.
Yeah.
You know?
And you've got what should be a fantastical landscape, a jungle of talking animals, which doesn't look terribly exciting.
Well, I think it's a pacing issue too. There's very little time at the beginning to establish Mowgli's world. We meet him and he's living with the wolves, and he's basically on the road pretty quickly, and we have no time to sort of establish.
Yeah, we don't really get his background until later in the film, which I actually think is a nice touch. I wish there was a little bit more kind of at the beginning, I wish there was a little bit more everywhere.
Yeah.
Because this is a version that really foregrounds the characters. But it doesn't spend that much time with them.
And I think it could be a tone issue too. I mean, I think you hit on something when you talked about how this is basically an adaptation of sort of a remake of the Disney version, because it wants to both be a slightly darker, edgier, more adult-oriented version of this, but at the same time, it's also working in a couple of those iconic songs from the Disney musical, sort of half committing to them.
They're not really handled like musical numbers.
I think it doesn't want to be a musical, but it still needs to work in those songs.
The King Louis sequence, I think, is the one that probably strikes the best balance, because it's a little bit silly, and it's retaining, sort of a musical quality to it. And it is at the same time kind of menacing, and it is making very interesting use of this marriage of effects and performance in the form of the Walken interpretation of the character.
I was quite fond of Bill Murray's
as
take
Baloo.
on Baloo. Yeah, he's never not Bill Murray, but he finds certain grace notes in there as well, and it really helps when you're trying to sell this sort of buffoonish comic character when you have a really gifted comedian playing him.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but I think this is a movie that is carried in many ways by the talents of the motion capture and voice cast.
Yep. We can both agree that this is a movie that has pretty fabulous special effects. I wonder, though, how it's going to look in 10 years or in 20 years. And the thing about really state-of-the-art special effects movies is that not all of them age that well. Watching this, I was thinking of something like Jumanji, which came out in 95. But you look at that at the time, and that looked amazing. And now you look at that, and
it all looks like melting plastic.
Yeah, it all looks completely phony.
All technology is ultimately going to become dated as far as effects are concerned. And for what doesn't age is the imagination behind them. And that's why I think people can still find Ray Harryhausen effects captivating, which were never really that convincing to begin with, but there is so much imagination behind them.
I think too many filmmakers use them as a catch-all solution. It's sort of a way to do something that they couldn't do otherwise. They use it for everything. There's a very sort of infamous special effects shot. It's in this movie, Along Came a Spider.
It's the car going off the road.
It looks just about as phony as something can possibly look. And for an effect that you could do practically with a car, people basically started using CGI to do things you could do otherwise, and I think that's a big problem. I think that's one of the reasons these films age so much.
And I still find a lot of early cinema really captivating.
Sure.
You know, like these Georges Méliès trick films are still really ingenious and really impressive because there's so much energy behind them. There's so much imagination behind them.
I think ultimately in the long haul, the special effects that tend to age the best are when we're being shown something that doesn't exist in the real world, where they're using the special effects technology to create something new. I think one of the reasons Terminator 2, for example, still looks like a seminal special effects movie is that there's nothing like the T-1000 in the world. For me, the great special effects movie of all time, and I feel like we bring up this filmmaker every week, but
as we should,
yeah, is John Carpenter's The Thing, where he's using all kinds of practical effects to create this monster, and it looks real. It looks as real as something this fantastic can look.
The films where the special effects have aged well is that they're made with the understanding that there are limits. Part of the problem with digital was that it introduced this idea that there basically were no limits for what you could do, but the fact is that there are limits for what can look convincing.
Yep.
And in a lot of those early films, you're seeing them make decisions based on what they think is not going to look convincing. And so like Star Wars is, that's an example of a film that definitely sticks to effects that it can pull off. Or that it knows it can sort of innovatively.
Well, and that's a good point, because the original version of Star Wars, I think the special effects hold up really well. The stuff inserted in 1997, when suddenly Lucas could do things that he couldn't do before, those effects have not held up well at all.